welcome. Thank you for turning up. I'm proud of all of you. Today we will be talking predominantly about democracy and not even a little bit about liberalism. So please scrap the liberal part of this session for the purposes of today. Okay, so the outline is pretty straightforward. We're first, because this session is going to run for half an hour, no questions asked. I will stop mid-sentence if I have to. We're first just going to run through some quick issues in democracy debates and how you can set them up, and then some topics, and we'll try and figure out how we can use the principles, which I will talk about quickly in establishing yourself in those kinds of topics. All right, so generally, democracy as a system of government attempts to maximise the following three things: accountability, representation, and participation. Let's try and establish a working definition of all of those so we can figure out what we're doing. Who wants to talk to me about accountability? Because obviously I don't know the answer, so anyone want to tell me what it is?
I don't even know.
It should be pretty straightforward, people. Stephen, do you want to give me an answer?
The ability to ultimately be answerable to someone for your actions.
Okay, yep, sure. Representation. What does it mean?
The things that government do to be representative of the various components of the people.
Yep, sure. Okay, and participation. Presumably the most straightforward of all of them. Yes, good. People get involved. Yes, good. All right. So that's correct. So people get involved in the system. They're able to exercise, their rights. Okay. So those three things, and this is pretty much the core of almost every democracy debate, come at the expense of efficiency of government. Does someone want to give me an example of how that's true?
Well, when they come up with a new bill in the parliament, it has to be has to go into the lower house and it has to be approved by the upper house before it can actually be, and then even the court can change it.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Australia, at the very least, there are two houses of parliament, and that's predominantly an accountability measure. That's to make sure that if a particular party gets the majority in one house of parliament, they don't necessarily get it in the other house of parliament, which is why one of them is a house of review. But all that does is add time to the process of passing a bill. What's another example of how these two things directly conflict? Yep.
The more different views you get on a particular issue in government, the slower the process will be.
That's right. So, for example, the presence of minority parties can be seen as a way to keep big parties accountable for their actions, and at the same time, it can hold up the process, and that's particularly true in places, well, like the United States, where they can't really pass anything ever because they're so ineffective. That's also for a lot of other reasons. The other, most obvious example at the base of this is the election cycle itself. Why do we have elections only every 4 years? What's the rationale behind that?
If you had one all the time, it would be impossible to get anything done.
That's exactly right. So remember, everything we do is a political choice. We could have elections every single year, but presumably the government would be entirely ineffective at doing anything because they would constantly be campaigning. At the same time, we could have elections every 10 years, and that would free up governments to do a whole lot of things because they'd have to spend very little time campaigning, very little time worrying about getting back into government. But presumably the problem in that scenario would be that they have very little accountability and there's very minimal amount of things that we can do to them over that period of time if they stop representing the views of the public, if they stop doing anything that they were actually elected to do. So does that make sense? Almost every democracy debate at its heart is a question of maximising the principles of democracy, so the value of participation, the value of accountability, etc., against efficiency. Another way to look at this in terms of participation itself would be to ask the question of why most countries adopt a system of representative democracy and not direct democracy. Does everyone know what direct democracy is? Yeah, absolutely. In olden days, what we're talking about is literally everyone on the street having a big fight about trying to pass a bill, that kind of stuff. Not a bill per se, but exactly. So in order to be the most accountable and presumably the most representative, and also to maximise people's participation, when we wanted to change a law, we would presumably send that to a referendum all the time, so we could get individual people's views on every single thing that the government did. That would be the most representative way to do it. It would allow people to participate the most, and presumably it would be the most accountable. Someone, again, want to tell me why we don't do that? That's absolutely true. So on the one hand, there's a potential voter fatigue. People stop turning up. People stop taking any notice of the issues because they're bombarded by it. That's true. But why else don't we do it? Yep. Absolutely, because it would cost the government a shitload of money, because it would cost them a hell of a lot of time, and because it's generally a big load of fuss. That is the actual answer. So what you need to realise is we're on a spectrum here, where at one end of the spectrum, you have ultimate efficiency of government. And that efficiency would be if we very rarely got a say about what they did, if there were very few accountability mechanisms, etc. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have maximum accountability or maximum participation or maximum representation. Does that broadly make sense? So most decisions that we make about governments and about how they interact with people and about how voting systems work are trying to balance those two key aims of government, which means almost all of the time you'll be taking a position somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. So very rarely does anyone propose ultimate efficiency of government, like let's just institute a dictator and never have a vote again, right? Because that is basically the end of the efficiency spectrum. Similarly, no one ever really proposes that we have direct democracy, people taking to the streets on every single issue, people getting a vote on every single issue that the government ever talks about, which would sit at the other end of that spectrum. Yeah, right, Senate Online, yeah, I remember seeing them. Exactly, so you can see some people obviously care much more about the values of participation, representation, than possibly the general public. So that's kind of the broad way in which most debates are set up, because those things are a trade-off usually. Let's talk a little bit more specifically. So, one of the main ways that a lot of Western countries anyway choose to make governments accountable is by separating the key powers that governments could have into various arms. Does someone want to explain to me quickly, possibly a law student, how the separation of powers operates? Who are those three actors? Yep, Kelly? Sure, absolutely. Yep. Legislature? Yep. 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 So does someone want to tell me why we create different bodies of people who have power over different areas? Because again, presumably it would be most efficient to give ultimate power to one centralised government. So for example, the executive. Maybe it would be the quickest and easiest to give ultimate power to the Prime Minister or the President or something along those lines, because they could pass things quicker, because things would be easier. Why don't we do that? Anyone who hasn't spoken? No? All right, Kelly. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So it's to avoid corruption and abuse of power. Okay, so that's, as you can see, again, on the kind of accountability end of the spectrum versus efficiency, but obviously a lot of people think is important. What are the other ways we keep governments accountable? Just list some off. Yep, say what? Media, yep, that's a huge one. Obviously that operates in an unofficial capacity because we don't appoint media to keep the government accountable, but in most Western countries it certainly plays a huge role in doing so. Anyone else? Elections, right. That's the most obvious way where you can vote them out if they do stuff that you don't agree with. Opposition parties, minority parties, all the other people that make up the voting group that actually passes legislation. Exactly, so... Yeah, absolutely. So the important thing to remember when you're talking in any debate about how governments are kept accountable is that there are a variety of mechanisms by which we keep a government accountable, the most obvious being elections and, the most direct being elections, and then a whole lot of other indirect ones from there. But every time we increase the power of one of those mechanisms, we presumably make governments a little less efficient than they would otherwise be. And you'll notice in the topics that are going to get set for tonight's debate, there's one that very heavily relies on this particular debate about accountability versus efficiency. All right, let's talk about the next one, which is representation. Does someone want to tell me, considering representation, Finlay already gave us a definition, is presumably how much the government does, which is in line with the views of the voting public and the reasons why it was elected. Does someone want to tell me what a mandate is? Kelly? Absolutely. So the way, once again, most Western countries, most democratic countries are established is that the government in and of itself has no power except for the power which the people translate to the government via an election process. So what is the value, do you think, of talking about a government's mandate? Why would you think that ever might come up in a debate? How do we test a government's mandate? Yeah, Kelly? Yep, so one of the main ways we test whether or not government is mandated to take a particular action is whether or not they campaign on that platform during an election and then were subsequently elected. What are the other issues that determine whether or not governments have mandates to do things? Because often, in most countries, governments don't campaign on every single issue which they legislate on in their term. Yeah, absolutely. So another big one, particularly in countries that have quite clear systems of large majority parties, is that we presume that to a degree people are informed about the base level ideology of a party when they vote for them. So even if the ALP doesn't necessarily campaign on every single piece of legislation it will introduce, it certainly campaigns on enough of them that people can draw broad conclusions about what the kinds of policy will be that the ALP will or won't support. Obviously, again, there's a limit to that, insofar as mandates are also determined by, for example, the margin by which a government wins. So right now in Australia, who has a clear mandate to rule? No one, right? Because it's pretty conflicted. The populace at large are pretty conflicted about who they agree with. So right now, you could certainly argue that the mandate of any government is pretty limited, and that actually they don't have a broad sweeping support of the populace, which means they could introduce anything that broadly falls in line with their ideology. So once again, whilst mandates and the concept of a government having a mandate is important, it's not necessarily the most important thing, but certainly you need to be able to analyse why a mandate is important and how we can measure whether or not a government has a mandate, what the value of that is in terms of representing the populace. The other big issue when it comes to representation is minorities. Someone want to tell me the classic problem with democratic systems? What are they aimed to do? Absolutely. So democracies are principally based upon the rule of the majority. Whatever the majority vote for will be elected and will run the country. What are some problems with that? True, that's true. And that's certainly one way of saying it. Does somebody want to give me any other ideas? Yes, good. Yes. Okay. So obviously the problem is that often minorities aren't represented all that well in democratic systems. So whilst representation as a concept is something that democracies aim to maximise, there are inherent structural reasons why democracies aren't necessarily that good at representing the entire populace so much as just a particular majority in a particular election cycle. What are some ways that we protect against that though? What are some ways that minorities are still represented even when there's a bias towards a majority rule? Yep. Yep, absolutely. What else? Yep, Kelly? That's exactly right. So do you want to explain how that operates? Yep, so the basic system is that if 10% of people vote for a particular party or whatever, then they get 10% of the people who are elected. So that's a good way, as opposed to in certain systems that don't have that system, of making sure that minorities can still get a voice, they can still get one or two people making decisions on their behalf, as opposed to no one at all. Are there any other ways that you think that the system operates now to protect the interests of minorities?
I guess state boundaries ensure that depending on which state's marginal, like our particular community minorities within the.
Absolutely. And one of the key issues, and this is one of the debates that often comes up, and there was a topic about this at WUPID last year, was about potentially giving more votes to particular minority groups. So that's something which is often canvassed in debating, very rarely canvassed in the real world because it's got a whole lot of other problems. But there are a whole lot of debates which will centre around how minorities are treated and how they interact with democratic systems. And again, it's important to recognise that there are a variety of ways that the system adapts right now to the problems of majoritarian rule, but there are also some values in having a majority rule a particular system. What would those be? True. So sometimes the minority are crazy, that's true. Anything else? Sure, absolutely. So like, principally, there is a basis for having a majority rule because they have come to some general consensus, and minorities, you can, I guess, make the argument, are minorities for a reason in a lot of particular cases, as opposed to minorities of like ethnic background. But on a particular issue, minorities often have crazy views, right? That's generally what you can say. That's exactly right. The other thing is in terms of efficiency. Again, you can't ever come to a conclusion and have a policy which will represent the interests and the needs of every single person. So at some stage, you have to draw an arbitrary line about what is and isn't a priority, and presumably at that stage, it makes a whole lot of sense to draw the line where the majority falls on that particular issue. All right, participation. What's the main way that people participate in the democratic system? Elections, yep. What's the other obvious way that people participate? Yeah, absolutely. So running for positions. Those are things that are open to a large number of the populace, certainly not everyone in every case, but absolutely those are the main ways people will participate. That's straightforward. Let's have a look quickly at something which is less obvious, which is about when we restrict people's participation in elections and why. Someone want to tell me who doesn't get a vote? Yep. Criminals. Who else? Oh, there you go. All right. Yep, mentally disabled people, children, criminals, etc. Why not? True, but we don't IQ test voting. And that would be a more direct way of cutting out stupid people from the system. Yep, absolutely. Yep. That's probably the pessimistic way of looking at it, because we might have to consider their rights a little more if they had a vote. That's true. I'm not sure how successful you're going to be in a debate arguing that the reason to not give them a vote is we might have to consider their rights. But that might be one way of attacking it. Yep.
Is it the basic idea that when you commit a crime and when you commit a crime against the state, that you see particular rights at that stage? Like in the same way you see the right to effectively freedom of movement or freedom of watching television, whatever.
Yep.
You also see the right to vote, and it's part of the imprisonment system.
Absolutely. So there are a variety of rationales behind excluding particular people from voting, like their mental capability to understand what they're voting for, like the fact that they've breached the social contract, that kind of thing. But the important thing to take away from this is it's a political decision that we make all of the time to restrict people's access to participating in democracies. Another really obvious example of this is how people can participate in campaigns and what people can do to campaign and who can donate money and all of those things are questions of participation, and when we draw the line at who should or shouldn't be able to participate. What I'm trying to get at here is that all of the values that democracies try to uphold all have limits, and they all have limits for a variety of reasons, and those are what debates are about. They're about where we draw those limits and why, and what the benefits or harms thereof are, basically. All right. So I am going to get done on time because this has been very straightforward. These are some examples which we're just going to run through quickly and talk about how we might use some of the things we talked about today in terms of these topics. So I think last year at Easter, maybe the year before, there was actually a topic that we should abolish a House of Parliament. So obviously there's the first question of which House of Parliament. But forgetting about that for a second, what do you think the implications of what we've talked about here today are for this topic? Absolutely. So explain that out for me. Yep. And what's the benefit of that? Yep, absolutely. People aren't left waiting while laws pass. That's absolutely a huge benefit of abolishing a House of Parliament. What's the opposite side of that? What are we sacrificing in favour of efficiency? Yeah. Yep, so explain that to me. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. So there's two key concepts that Kelly just pointed to, which we've talked about. So you might be sacrificing a degree of accountability because once you have a party that rules in one house alone, they can then pass any legislation they want because they've got a majority on those issues, right? So obviously that's problematic for a variety of obvious and not so obvious reasons. So that's accountability, but you're also, to a degree, sacrificing representation because the likelihood that minority views are ever going to be acknowledged when you have a majority party in one particular house is very minimal, and you certainly make that more likely if you have more houses of review of a particular policy. Okay, absolutely. Let's quickly run through the second one about electing judges. This one also comes up much more regularly than you would want or think. So does someone want to tell me what the kind of principal reasons in favour or against this are in terms of what we talked about today? Someone aside from Kelly? Anyone? Yeah, absolutely. So there's a question then of the actual outcome of politicising the judge pool, but why is that a problem?
Separation of powers was made to make the judiciary separate.
Yeah, so again, that specific argument feeds back into the principle of accountability and the fact that the judiciary represent a check and balance against the government and against the popular will and against all the political processes that establish who makes decisions, and that if you introduce all of those processes into the judiciary, then the value that they have as a check and balance on government is severely minimised, right? So again, that feeds straight back into that principle of accountability. Someone want to tell me from the other side what they think the principle is? Luke? Absolutely. So there's an argument about accountability and where the accountability should lie. So the argument from the affirmative is that accountability should ultimately rest with the people, and that the people, like the judges, are more accountable to people if those people elect those judges directly, as opposed to them being appointed by governments or whatever process we go through to actually give judges their spot. Okay, so there's an accountability principle that sits on the affirmative. What's the other really obvious principle that sits on the affirmative? Yeah, absolutely. Why do we care?
Because the laws are there to regulate the society we live in, so they should reflect the views of that society.
Yeah, exactly. So there's an obvious argument about why representation in this particular instance is of benefit, because those laws govern the way that people interact and because they have to be relevant to individual people for them to take them seriously. And a whole host of other arguments that come purely from the principle of representation and why I would stand up for it. All right. Let's quickly run through the final one, which is lowering the voting age to 16. Someone want to go through the same process for me and tell me which principles apply here and why? Rang Tom?
No, not really.
All right, that's outrageous. Yeah, so explain that for me, Lyndon. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a crucial argument in this debate from the affirmative about participation, but it's not just about saying that increasing participation is good or that maximising participation is good. So someone explain to me why participation in democracy is of value and of benefit and why we should care. Why would an adjudicator care if your team can just get up and say, we increase participation, end debate? Why do we care? Yep, Eleanor. Sure, so it increases the scope of issues which get talked about, which also presumably feeds into an argument about representation of the general populace and the will of the populace and that kind of stuff. Why else? What's the value of people participating in a democracy? Amit? Absolutely. What else? Yep. So, like, participation, obviously, at its core, feeds into both representation and accountability as an aim. What's the value for individual people of participating in democracy? Pardon? They do, that's true. Yep. Good.
16-year-olds have more of an incentive. If they're allowed to vote, 16-year-olds have, I guess, more of an incentive to follow the decisions made by the government if they actually have a say in the government decisions.
Yep, I think that's partially true, and that's certainly true of participation as a whole, that if people are given the opportunity to participate in the way that laws are formed or in the way that the government operates, then they're more likely to actually accept that process. But secondly, also, they're more likely to take it seriously in terms of the way they actually interact with that in the future. That's like a sub-point of that. So, like, if you want people to be responsible voters and responsible citizens, etc., and you want them to make the effort to actually become knowledgeable about policies and to actually give a rat's who gets elected, then you need to give them some power, right? So that's like a specific one about 16-year-olds. But again, like, there's obvious arguments in regards to participation and representation and accountability on the app. What are the arguments on the neg? True. What would that fall under? Representation. We will be represented by Justin Bieber. Yes, good. Anything else that's more broad than the Justin Bieber argument? Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Which is implicitly an argument against participation in some cases, because there are a whole host of people who, for example, don't give a rat's about elections, and in Australia are forced to vote. In many places are not forced to vote. In many places never vote in their lives because they couldn't care. So that's an argument against expansion of participation, because often people don't care, or because often people don't have the capacity to participate, which was something that Linton said earlier in terms of their, like, knowledge of the situation, in terms of their mental capacity, etc. Yep.